Morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to our third webinar. Today we will talk about the integration platform. My name is David Parras. I'm the sales director at EMEA level, and really it's a pleasure for me to be here today with all of you. I hope you are doing well, you are safe and healthy. And well, this webinar, I think most of you were looking for these topics, because you like to understand better how you can easily integrate BarTender with any type of business system, ERP, MES, warehouse management solution, both on premise and also on cloud. And our master, Ian Cummins, will show you how easy it is to do that. And I also like to remind you that we also got a professional service team that can help you in those integration in those situations that you are talking with a customer and the customer are asking you for something very specific that maybe you got doubt how you can do that. Remember, we've got a team, professional services, that will be more than happy to help you with any type of integration or any complex installation of BarTender. Without further delays, I hand over to Ian. Ian.
So, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's well. Today, with this webinar, we're covering the integration platform. We're going to dive deep into detail on the integration platform specifically, and hopefully answer all those questions that you may have had in the past. So in terms of the agenda, first we're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation like in previous webinars, trying to keep it as brief as possible, just covering the main concepts, and then we want to get on hands-on with the software to go through the different aspects of the integration platform, how to set it up, how to use it, how to test and deploy, etc. So hopefully we'll cover all aspects that people are wanting to see. So, integration platform. Basically, to integrate BarTender with almost any business system or device quickly and easily for automated printing without the need for any programming. And that's a key part, actually. It's bringing together a set of technologies that allow for the creation and the ability to automate BarTenders, well, bringing in a document design, but also taking in BarTender's print engine, its printing capability to print your BarTender design documents in an automated fashion, inserting in the variable data coming from your business systems or devices, so elsewhere in the organization. And to do that quickly and easily, as it states there, with no programming, because businesses want to get these workflows, these processes to execute and be deployed as soon as possible. And if it requires any programming, that's when you start to hit roadblocks where you don't have access to programmers, or the programmers are busy doing other stuff. So the things that you want to happen just never get done. So integration platform are the keys to making things happen for your customers. Okay, first though, before we look at the integration platform itself, we want to take a look first at ERPs, business systems, and indeed devices, and how they would go about connecting to BarTender. Basically, with such business software, it is common for a business system to initiate a request for an external system, and this could be any external system. It could be BarTender, of course, but it could be some other external software that performs some other tasks. And the purpose of that is to have that other system execute actions that the business system, the ERP itself, is not able to perform, or is not able to perform very well. Therefore, business systems tend to have a variety of different methods to accomplish the task of sending that request to other systems. And the way it does this, this will depend very much on the ERP, the business system that you're using, is through, and there's different terminology for this, depending on which articles you read, but connectors, adapters, and events. The way I look at it, the way I've, in my mind, taken things to mean, is that a connector is an instance of how you wish your business system to connect with something else. What I mean by an instance, it's very particular for that particular thing. Whereas an adapter, I see that as being a type. So if you want to connect to BarTender generically, you would have a BarTender adapter type. Whereas if you want to connect with BarTender in a very particular way, then that's where you have a connector instance that would use a BarTender adapter type. Now, in most business systems, there is not some ready-made BarTender adapter that you can just simply select, tweak a few options, and then go ahead. So instead, when you're in your business system and you're wanting to connect, to create a connection instance, you would choose a generic adapter type, such as to output a file or to make a standard REST-based web service request or to send an email. But it's not, as you see here in the items below, it's not just, well, the transport protocol, i.e. a file, a web service request, or whatever. It's also the mapping of field data. What data do you want to come out of your business system and be put into the event message? The message protocol itself, so the format of the data, is it CSV data? Is it XML data? What is the format of the content? The transport is the method in which the message is sent, file, email, web service request, etc. And the destination of where that message is being sent to. So all of these different items would be configured as part of your connector instance. And the adapter type would say, oh, well, I'm outputting a file and I'll map these fields. The data will be in this format and I'm dropping it into that folder. All of that information, all of those properties combined make up a connector instance. And that connector instance, we come to the bottom there, you would then hook up to a particular event in your business system. Or when you want to execute a workflow in the business system, you would tack on that particular connector type so that it will automatically output that data as a message to the external system, being BarTender in this case. Now, different business systems have different terminology and they do things slightly different ways, but from a generic sense, from a generic perspective, this essentially is what you're looking at. And yes, different business systems will either do this much easier or be perhaps more cryptic on how this is done. But for most customers who operate such business software, this is typically a fairly common task for a configurator of the system to perform. Okay, let's look at the integration platform itself now. From a high-level view, we have a business system on the left of various different types, and the integration platform is designed to work with all manner of different business systems. And we have a printer, typically a barcode label printer, on the right. Unfortunately, business systems tend to be not the greatest at printing or producing a print job for a barcode label printer. So this is where BarTender comes in. BarTender itself in terms of the design and print engine capability, but also the integration platform, as this is the glue that connects the business system to the world of BarTender. And of course, as was intimated from the previous slide, we are receiving a message from that business system. We built an integration in the integration platform, which is actively listening for that event message. And when it receives it, it can then perform actions, which is typically to print a BarTender document. And to do this, we make use of the BarTender print engine, and the document is printed and sent to the target printer using the Windows Print Manager. We call it the integration platform because it consists of various different component parts. So there you see on the left, you have the applications. The two key applications is the integration builder that allows you to quickly and easily create, build, test the integrations. And once the integrations are built and tested and all seems fine, you can then use the administration console, a section of which you can deploy your integration from your workstation over the network to your production server, and also from your workstation using the administration console, you can remotely manage and monitor those integrations that are running on the production server. On the production server itself, we're using service-oriented architecture. So we have two core Windows services. The first is the integration service, which is hosting the integration. So whatever integration it is, it's hosting that and is performing the task of listening for those event messages. It can also execute actions if the actions are non-BarTender document related. However, if it is BarTender document related, then those requests or those actions are passed over to the print scheduler service, as this controls a collection of BarTender print engines. And the print scheduler service can be configured to automatically scale the number of print engines according to the capabilities of your server. And it also can be used to intelligently assign a print request to the most available and applicable print engine to actually execute the print job. And that takes us to the third part, which of course is the collection of BarTender print engines. And the print scheduler will select one of those print engines, which ultimately is responsible in conjunction with a Windows printer driver, possibly a Siegel Scientific printer driver, to render the print job in native print code and get that sent to the target printer. If we look at the integration workflow of this, we can see there on the left-hand side the different types of integration, and we'll be going through each of those in turn when we go hands-on. Each of these are feeding into the integration service, which can either execute non-document actions directly. Otherwise, if it is a BarTender document action, it's passed to the print scheduler service, which assigns to a print engine, generates the print job, sent to the printer, and out comes a printed label. We hope. Okay, so application usage. And this is the general workflow that you're looking at when you're setting up your integration. The first thing you'd want to do is, in the BarTender Designer, design your document. In particular, set up your variable data sources, whether this is for record data or named data sources for key value pairs. Want to make sure that in the world of automated printing that you can set the variable data on that label with the transactional data coming from the business system. So you've got to make sure that that is properly configured and exposed so it can be then set from your integration. This then takes us on to the integration builder, where you build your integration, probably, but not always, to print your BarTender document. So first you have the integration properties, where you define what it is that you're looking to detect, and then you have the actions of what you want to do. In the integration builder, you can test that and save that as an integration file, which takes us to the administration console, from where you can then deploy, manage, and monitor your integration. So in the document design, of course, you design your document for how you want it to look. You'll set up your data sources, either record data or name data sources, as you see there. And with the record data, we can set both document level data, but also data for a table if you're making use of a data sourced table in your document. And both of these can be set via automation, via the integration platform. Once the integration is built, you can use the incorporated sandbox of the integration builder to test your integration. So you just switch over to the test tab, start your testing, and then have event message be sent to it in order to trigger the integration and monitor for results. In addition to this, you can, of course, view the messages, the status, and the value of the various variables running in your integration. You can also record and set sample data, so you don't always have to continually go back to your business system in order to trigger a new event. You can simulate printing to screen, so if you don't have a printer handy and available to you, you can enable that feature and see on screen the printed results. And you can also execute the BTXML script from within the testing section. Integration variables. Now, this is a very interesting topic for the integration platform. Essentially, a variable, as is always the case, it's going to have a name. So what is the name of the variable? And then also, what is the value of the variable? In the context of integration platform, variables are used in a way that it allows us to make your integrations dynamic. So rather than the integration behave in a very static, it is what it is sort of way, you want at time of the event to dynamically change what it's doing according to values that you set, and values that you set for these variables, for example. So how can you set a value of a variable? Well, this can be done either in the predefined way, generated as part of the event message, depending on the type of event message and the content. And also, a variable can be set as a result of an action. The most obvious example would be the set variable action, but there are others. Also with variables, we can run what are called integration variable expressions. And this actually makes use of JavaScript and provides extra nuance and extra function on how you make use of those variables. And I'll be showing you how that is done later. Once the integration is detected, variable set, etc., we then come to what do we want to do. as a result. So what do we want to do in terms of actions? And this actions fall into, 7 different categories. So we have printing actions, which is obviously for printing BarTender documents. Transform actions, where we're taking the input data and we're wanting to modify or validate that data in some fashion. With inputs, this is where we can take additional secondary inputs as a follow-up to the initial event message. So if we want to have additional data coming from other sources for the following actions we then execute, then we can do that. We can also send out our own messages to other systems. So just like an ERP, the integration platform itself can integrate with other business systems, software, and devices to communicate with them. Under execute, this basically covers a wide selection of various miscellaneous items which don't fit into the various other categories, and we'll look at that a bit later. File, this is covering actions to do with file, folder, and archive file actions. So if you want to perform any actions with those items, we can. And lastly, database transaction. Well, as the name suggests, if you want to read, write, update, insert, or delete records in a database, or run a stored procedure in a SQL database, then you would choose one of those actions. Request response. So the business system makes the request of BarTender. Do we send a response back to that system to give it some status or verification of its request? So the reasons why we'd want to do this. First is to confirm and verify, for example, if you're printing a label, the success or failure of that print job, to give that status, that verification, so that the business system knows what the response was, what the result was. If the request was for a print preview, then the response could contain images of the print job preview for the business system to either display to a print operator or to perhaps log in its own for its own purposes. Which of course takes us to the last one there, is if the business system wants to log these print jobs and print requests and print results in its own data silo. So rather than necessarily just have a print job log on the BarTender side of things, you can also have a print job log in the business system, the business software. By default, the response makes use of the BTXML response syntax. So this is an XML schema of BarTender that gives information about the print job or the print job preview. But this is totally customizable, so you can customize that in whatever way you want. It doesn't have to be XML. It could just be a string of text saying, yay, your label printed successfully. So it's very customizable in that respect. Also, by default, we're performing synchronous processing. In that a request is sent to us, we perform actions, we detect the request, we perform actions, and then send back a response, all as part of the same workflow. If you have customers who ask about asynchronous processing, this is not supported natively by default, but it can be implemented with the integration platform. Basically, with the asynchronous processing, this is where a business system will make a request, and we would send back a response immediately saying, yes, we got your request. But then the actual performing of the request, depending on its nature, might happen at a later time. At that later time, we perform that request, and we would then, at that time of finishing the final request, we would then send a second response saying that this request, based with this particular ID, which matches the ID of the original request that was made, that has now completed with this result. So yes, asynchronous processing is possible, but it's something you would need to implement. It's not something that's directly there to use. And it also should be noted that the response is only supported by certain integration types, namely web services, network socket, and serial port. When I say supported, I mean directly supported as part of the integration type. So there's a response built in to the protocol being used. So if you imagine dropping a file to a folder, that's very much a unidirectional request. Just like with the asynchronous processing, it can be implemented that we send some form of response once a file trigger has been processed, but it's not incorporated as part of the integration type. And finally, here's an example integration where we see there on the left-hand side, the business system, print operators interacting with it, and they press a button which generates an XML, possibly as a web service request. As you can see, there's an arrow going back to the business system, which indicates that there's a response being sent back. The request is detected by the integration service, and it will then control a BarTender print engine to merge in the variable data from the XML into the BarTender document, which is loaded from the document store, which can be either the file system or a librarian if you're doing document management. And of course, that file system or librarian is populated with document design files from a label designer user who's using BarTender Designer to create their document designs and then store them in the document store. Print job is produced, sent to the printer, barcode label printed. All very good. So let's go hands-on with the integration platform. Let's close this and take a look at the integration builder first. To take a look at around the user interface, here at the top we have our menu system. So we can create integrations, we can test integrations, we can go to deploy them, which will open up the administration console, and we can manage aspects there too. And under tools, we can switch to one of the other companion applications of BarTender software. Under each toolbar, you have access to the various different options. And beneath that, we have essentially 3 separate panels. The first panel, as you see here, contains each of the integrations for this one integration file. So I've got an integration file called webinar example 1. So if I opened up my Windows Explorer, you'd see that as an integration file. In fact, if I just bring that up, I'll just scoot that on screen so you can see it. So I have two integration files. This first one, which we're looking at now, and a second one, which we'll look at a bit later. So these are each of the integrations that I built in this file. We'll be looking at each of them in turn. With one of these selected, we can then see in the second panel the first set of properties for how we're defining the integration, what it is that we're listening for, and then the series of actions we wish to perform. And of course, in this example, we have just the one action, but I can add as many actions as I wish. And as you see, when I do that, we can see the different categories of action, and in each category, what specific action we may wish to execute. As you can see, altogether, there's quite a lot. So there's a lot of functionality that you can leverage using the integration platform based on an event occurring and a message being sent from your business system or device. Finally, on the third panel, these are the individual properties of each of these items that you've selected based on the integration you've selected and what part of that integration you have selected. You will see the appropriate set of properties. Okay, so let's dive in. The first integration is perhaps one of the more popular or most popular integration types, and that is a file integration. With this selected, you'll notice that I got the top item here at the top, the parent node of the integration properties. And from here, you can give the integration a name and a description. The name is actually important because it affects what you see here, but also when you deploy your integration, it is listed by its name. So for example, if you had 10 file integrations, well, they would need to be unique, but you wouldn't want to leave that as being called file integration because you wouldn't know which one is which. So typically when you're naming your integrations, you want to give it a name that is explaining what the business process is. What is it? What is it doing? What is the purpose? And yes, I see someone asking, can you have copies of these files? Yes, you'll get copies of these files after the presentation. No worries. Start integration. Well, this is rather like services, Windows services, automatic, manual, disabled. So when Windows starts, Windows services starts, which includes the integration service, and any integrations that are deployed to that integration service will also automatically start so long as your integration is set to automatic. And this means that, for example, if the production server, if there's a power failure and it gets restarted for whatever reason, as soon as that server comes back online, the customer's integrations will also be back online, waiting for events to happen. So typically you'd want to set that as automatic. You'd only set to manual or disabled if you're performing diagnostics for whatever purpose. Action execution. Immediately execute actions and process the next event, or do you wish to verify or wait for actions to complete? So this affects the throughput, the processing of integration messages. Are they all fully independent, or would you want integrations to be run in a very sequential fashion as opposed to in a parallel fashion? I hate this VPN thing. Always coming up with a prompt. So typically I leave that as immediately execute actions. but you can choose other options if you wish. Under the user account, essentially this is saying under which user account will the action execute. And by default, we're inheriting from the integration service, which is using the local system account. Now, 9 times or 99 times out of 100, leaving at that is just fine, because this means that the integration will run under the local system account, which has, I think it's at local admin privileges over the computer that it's running upon. However, with a file integration, it may be the case, instead of scanning a local folder, maybe you want to scan a network folder. And for that network folder, it may be the case, let's change the folder there. It may be the case that you need particular permissions in order to access that network folder. If that is the case, then likely is you would want to change the user account to make use of user credentials of an account that does have permission to access that network folder, because the local system account may not. So it depends, particularly for file integrations, what location it is you're scanning. And so let's look at this further. In terms of locations, you can look at the local computer network. You can look for files being dropped into Librarian. And you can also add additional locations if you want to have access to cloud or FTP based file storage locations. So you're not just limited to your local Windows network or wide area network. There's an option to scan for subdirectories, so child folders. If your integration is being run on more than one production server, so let's say you have a very high demand, high frequency printing requirement with many files being dropped into folders at a very high frequency, it may be the case you need more than one server to handle all of that. Because BarTender's licensing is based on printer-based licensing, you can actually install and run multiple BarTender servers at the same time. And if you do that, in order to avoid duplications of a print job, you need to specify that the folder is scanned by multiple integrations on multiple servers. And that changes the way in which we detect and lock the event message files so that only one of the servers performs the task. But if you only are running one production server, then leave that unticked. Actually, someone's asking about if you set a domain account, should you use a UNC path? The thing with UNC paths is that they're universal. Universal naming convention is what UNC stands for. And that means that despite who the user is, the user account, the user profile, it will work for everyone so long as you have permission, of course. So using a UNC path is always the safe option because it's universal. What can break is where you're using a mapped drive letter. So if you've got a network folder and you map that to drive letter F, for example, it should be noted that that drive mapping is only specific to that one particular user. So if your integration executes in a different user, such as the local system account, for example, which would be a different user from your actual logged in Windows user account, then the mapped drive letter will fail because it's specific just to that user profile. Therefore, UNC path is always the best way to go. Okay. Read event contents. By default, this is ticked because, of course, if you're dropping a CSV file into a folder for a print document action to then execute on, you'd want to read the contents of that CSV file in order for your action to use that as a data source, for a record data source. So by default, that is on. And actually, when we read in that content, we store that to what's called the event data integration variable. So it's called event data, and you can use that event data variable to reference and set the record data source of your document. And in fact, when we've read the content, the actual file itself is no longer needed. It's surplus to requirements. And in fact, you can delete it or move it or do whatever you wish with it, because the performance of the print document actions will be connecting to the event data variable instead. There is a reason why you would not want to read the contents, and I have that in an example a bit later. Scanning method, notification or polling. Notification is where we're using the file system notification object of Windows, so messaging system, and it's quicker and more efficient, but only works with a Windows file system, and it's not as reliable if you're using it over a network connection. It works best when it's local or on a very fast responding network connection. So if that's not the case, maybe you're scanning a folder on Linux or something, then you'd want to use polling instead. And with polling, we're basically scanning a directory every X number of seconds. And you don't want to go crazy with this, going into the sub-second category, because if you're doing that, then you're going to be using up more resources than is really necessary, keeping your production server busy getting directory listings all the time. File pattern, this is the type or the name of the file that you want to use. You can use your standard file wildcards or even a regular expression to define the name of the file that you're scanning for. And you can also do things such as setting a minimum file size. So one thing I like to do is say, well, it needs to be at least 100 bytes of data. Otherwise, we'll ignore that because maybe it's a truncated or an empty data file, and we don't want to try producing a print job from an invalid file. So it's kind of a very simple validation technique you can perform there. Likewise, for maximum file size, you can set timeouts for a locked file, etc. And you can set a sort order if you're dropping multiple files all at the same time and you want to order the process or order the order in which you process those files, then you would set your your criteria there, choosing your sort field and whether you do that in ascending or descending order, etc. I'll leave that off for now. Okay, once the file is detected, what do you want to do? In terms of options, you can do nothing with the file, rename the file, delete the file, or move the file. Now remember, as I mentioned earlier, when we detect the file, the first thing the integration service does is read the contents of that file. So in this case, the CSV data is actually stored as a variable. The file itself is no longer needed. My recommendation is to move that to a archive folder. So I move it to a completed folder, for example, giving it a new extension of txt. So in this case, I'm moving it for visibility purposes of an administrator, so they can see the files that have been processed. Likewise, if there's a failure, rather than leaving the file or deleting the file, I move it to a failed folder. So again, an admin can very quickly and easily see if there are any recent failures, because there'll be a file in the failed folder. One reason for moving the files is that it keeps the scanned folder as clear and empty as possible. If you imagine we're doing a directory listing of the folder, in this case every 1 second, if after a couple of months you have 5,000 files in that folder, then that's going to be putting a lot of burden on your server with extremely long directory listings that we then have to sort through looking for a particular matching file. So always best to keep that scanned folder as empty as possible by either deleting or moving the already processed files. Coming to the input data, we can see this is set for CSV text, so comma separated values, just record data, and the input encoding is Unicode UTF-8. Of course, there are other input data formats that we can choose, and this helps the integration platform decide how to understand the data that's coming in. And of course, the input coding, you'll choose the appropriate input input encoding according to the data and the locale that you're using. Under variables, here we can see the various predefined integration variables, rather like environmental variables that, for example, give us a detected file folder, the detected file name without extension, the path of the file, current date and time, all of that sort of stuff. These are very useful integration variables that can be used in the following actions. I'll be showing you how they can be used. You can also create a custom integration variable in a predefined fashion like so. But I won't do that in this case. And that custom integration variable will be applicable just to this particular integration. If you want to create a custom predefined variable which is global, we can go to the options item here, and from here we can create a variable that is usable and viewable by all of the integrations in our integration file. So you have that option there as well. That's whether you want to make it integration specific or available to all integrations in your integration file. Lastly, this takes us on to actions. And as we can see here, we can run actions either sequentially, so one after the other, or in parallel. So in this case, we only have the one action, but of course we can add as many actions as we wish. So let's choose another print document action, for example. So we now have two actions. If we're running these sequentially, they'll print this one first, and then it'll process the second one. If I choose to run these in parallel, because integration platform is multi-threaded, it would essentially would assign 2 print requests to 2 separate print engines to execute and process at the same time. So if it doesn't matter the order in which these 2 labels are printing, you can run them in parallel for faster processing. But if the order is important, then you'd want to choose to run them sequentially. I guess the order is more important for printing if both print jobs are being sent to the same printer and you want one particular print job to be done first and then the other. If we look at the action, we can see under the document tab, you can assign the document design that you wish to print. And here we have just a very simple address label. So the address here is using the data from the CSV file to give the address of the label. And we also have some other items which I'll come on to later, which can also be set. Under print options, we can choose the various metadata items of the printer we wish to print to, for example, and we can do this in a predefined way. So barcode printer A, for example, and I can say the number of copies I wish to print. I can give the print job a name, etc., etc. If the integration is not to be fully automated, but is semi-automated, but also perhaps wanting to have print operator user input with a data entry form of the BarTender document, if you enable the prompt for data input, if you're printing a label that has a data entry form, it will present that data entry form on screen, which the user can then interact with. If this is unticked, then that form will always be hidden. So it will be a true automated process. It may be the case that a customer wants to have something partly automated, but the printer operator is at the PC, maybe it's a BarTender workstation, and they need to do some manual data entry as well. With the prompt for data input, they can interact with that BarTender data entry form to finalize the printing process. So it depends very much on the workflow. Is it fully automated, coming in from an ERP system, generating the print job automatically, or is it some sort of halfway house, it's semi-automated with additional data input? If that's the case, enable that checkbox. Under media handling, depending on what the printer supports, you can enable cutter and all that sort of stuff. And database overwrites. Now for this particular file integration, we're dropping a CSV file. So of course, we want to replace the dummy data that was set in the document design, so the default database connection, with the content of the variable event data. So we're replacing the document design data, the dummy data, with the data that's coming from the transaction, from the detected file. In fact, if I open up BarTender, go to that particular document, so let's go to my webinar folder, and these are the files I'll be getting you guys after this presentation. Open up the address, document. So here we can see our document design. We've got a database connection or a data file connections to the CSV data, and we've got a couple of named data sources. If I look at my database connection, here we can see the connection is called data, and we browse the records, we can see, yeah, it's just company name and address details connecting to a CSV data file. In fact, if I run the wizard, you'll notice here, and this is a new improvement in BarTender 2021, is that in the past you would actually need to connect to a file. And this is all very well, but if you then passing that to a colleague or from yourselves as a partner to a customer, they would need to have that file perhaps in the same path location. With BarTender 2021, we can instead embed sample data just by pasting it into this text field here. So now you don't have to worry about an external file, which makes the BarTender document much more portable from a design perspective. Doesn't actually affect it when it's in production, but for designers or for you as a partner working with a customer, it does simplify matters much more. So this is just a very simple document design used to facilitate and show the integration part, which is the more important part that we're interested in today. So with the database override, we're essentially replacing that data connection with the data contained in the CSV file that we detected. Verification options. This is more of importance for bidirectional integrations where we want to send a response back. So for a file integration, typically this is not important because we're not sending a response back. Under named data sources, we can choose to set our named data sources on the document. And at the moment, we don't have any listed, although we did see that there were 2 named data sources in the document. And in fact, if you want to see them, we can click on the Import Document Settings button like so. The integration builder will read in the properties of the document. So it can see what's been set for the printer, the copies, the record range, etc. But also it now has the list of the named data sources in the document and their current value. And of course, you can set this with whatever value you want, like so. If the document is connecting to a fixed database where it wants to pull some additional information and it has a query on that database connection, you could specify the value of the query criteria to find the matching records. Typically, this isn't used so much with integrations, but of course you can do that if that is necessary. So as well as being pushed the data from the business system, the BarTender document can then also pull additional data from another connected database in order to get the additional information. And with a query, it will allow you to filter just the particular records that you want to pull. And under action, well, I suppose I should just show you that. You would set that in very much the same fashion as you would do with a named data source. So if it had a query prompt and we imported the document settings, that query prompt would now be listed there and you could set a value to it. And lastly, under the Action tab, this tab you'll see for all actions, You can give the action a name. Always best to give it something descriptive. And you can specify how you wish to run the action. Now, typically, you would always want to run the action because, of course, why would you have it otherwise? But it may be the case you have an action that you have for diagnostic purposes. For example, you may create an action that writes out to file some key pieces of data that would aid you in diagnostics. When in production, you would want to set that to be never run. But if you want to then diagnose a problem, if you come across one, you could then re-enable that and perform tests, perhaps within the integration builder sandbox. And you can also choose to run it conditionally based on the value of a variable or based on an expression. So based on a variable, we can choose one of the variables. So at the moment, we just have predefined variables. But if you remember, variables can be predefined, set based on the integration event data, and also set by the result of a previous action. So if you have one of those other integration variables already created and set, you can then run this action accordingly. So depending on the result of that previous item, which sets a variable, you can then choose to run this action or not, as the case may be. So again, it adds that extra dimension of dynamicness to your integrations. But perhaps that's getting a bit advanced for now. Right. With this file integration, let's quickly test this. So we switch over to the Test tab, which will load the integration into the sandbox of the integration builder. So rather than needing to deploy your integrations each time in order to test them, we can instead test them within the safety of our workstation using the integration file directly. So we're just testing this particular integration. All these other integrations are not currently being tested. So we can start that up. Oh, did I already have some files in there? I guess I already had some files in there. So yeah, I guess I had a file in there. Okay, so I had a dummy data file and a transaction data file in my scan folder. Silly boy. So I already processed those and produced 2 print jobs. And we can see the messages that result from that. You can see the status and variables if we're still running the integration. Okay, in order to see what's going on, I can switch over to here, which is BarTender's History Explorer, where we can view the print job log of labels that were printed. And here we see one label and also the other one. So this one had some transactional data, and the first one had just the default data, which is why it's got my name Ian Cummings there instead. Alternatively, you could choose to enable simulate printing. So if I turn that on, start detection, it's now listening for a file, scanning the folder. And for this, I'll need to, hopefully there's a file that I can find somewhere. Get my CSV file, and here's my scan folder, and I'll just paste that into the scan folder in order to get it detected. Why is it not detecting? What did I do wrong? That is the right folder, isn't it? Okay, at this point we go into debug mode. Something went wrong. Why is that? So stop your testing, stop your detection, go back to the create mode, and we're having a problem detecting. So let's look at what we have set up in terms of what we're detecting, and I can see that's why. This should be scan. So that's why it automatically processed those two files, which was in that separate folder for, yes, now it all makes sense. I was scanning the wrong folder. Back to test, enable that. And now it's detected that CSV file straight away. And this time you'll see that it simulated the print results, and we've got a link that we can click to hopefully show an image of our printed label, like so. So for those guys working from home, they don't have a nice fancy barcode printer on their desk, you can do simulated label printing instead. And it also helps to save printed media as well. Much more immediate. Stop, go back to create, and let's look at some of the other event types. Now, as we look at each of these different event types, the actions that we're performing is more or less the same. The only difference between them is how we're detecting something and if there's a response or not. So with a web service, yes, there is a difference in terms of what it is that we're listening for. And there is a response that's built in. And by default, we're sending back the content of the response variable. And that response variable is set from our print action. In fact, if we go to that print option, our verification options places that verification detail into the response integration variable, which is what we're sending back to the origin, back to the business system. Okay, so everything else is more or less as you've seen for a file integration or any integration type. We're just simply changing the options on how we're detecting that event message and if it has a response built in. You'll notice that for the file integration, there is no response option because it's a unidirectional integration type. So this is a web service, and it's what I call a very simple web service integration called a GET request. The input data is unstructured data, and we're just printing a document, which was this one, the same document as before. Now you'll notice on the service, we're using an integration variable called integration name, which inserts the name of the integration into the URL path of the web service endpoint. Now, it may be the case that you want to use that name, or you may want to say, specify a literal service name or an explicit service name. So here I've got get query instead. And in fact, I'll change this to be get simple. And when I go there, you can see that the URL path is now changed accordingly. So it's http:// the name of your host. Now that can be just your computer name or the fully qualified domain name, or the IP address even, / integration, / the name of your service, in this case Get Simple, / execute. And by default, we're using port 80, which is the standard web port that you have for websites and most other web service requests. But you can change that if you wish. Another common option is to use port 8080, which is for internal web services. It's just a convention. You can actually use whatever port you wish, as long as there's not a conflict. So port 80 or port 8080 if you prefer. There's also authentication. So by default, we have anonymous authentication, but instead we can either make use of the Windows credentials of the system making the request, or basic authentication where they're supplying user account and password credentials as part of the request. So let's test this one out. Switch to test, hit start. Now we're now actively listening for a web service request. Now with the integration platform, we have an HTTP server integrated with basically the integration service is hosting an HTTP server, which is listening just like a web server for web service requests. Now, to make a web service request, you can do that in a number of different ways. But what I like to do is make use of what we call a REST client. Now, a REST client is a particular type of application that is typically used by web developers or by web service API developers who need to test HTTP REST web-based services. So here we have a simple GET request. What we mean by a GET request is just like when you're in your web browser and in the address bar you type in the HTTP and the address of your website. Here we're doing the same. You can see Get Simple is part of the address, and we can then hit send. Now with a REST client, it allows you to have much more control and visibility on what we get back as a result. Interesting. Why is it getting that result? Get Simple. What did I configure in my, maybe it's because I got simulated printing on. So what we're doing here, let's turn off the simulated printing. Do that again. It's part of the fun of doing live demos. It gives you unexpected results sometimes. Okay, now we see a more normal print response where we have details. And this is the BarTender XML response syntax, where you can see a lot of detail about the request and the status, different times, and of course, in a text item here, the final result, the success or otherwise, and the name of the print that it was sent to. So this is the BarTender XML script response, which is the default. But we can customize that if we wish. And you can see we can, from the testing sandbox of the integration builder, we can choose to repeat the last detection, so you don't have to send it from your business system again. We can also execute. So if we want to execute, if we have, let me stop this a second. What we can do is we can capture different events and have them as separate sample files, which you can then execute those sample files separately. So if you want to have a range of different events captured and recorded, so to speak, and then from the comfort of the Integration Builder sandbox, just choose to fire each of those samples as an event which gets detected, you can do so in a much more convenient way than needing to go out to the external application in order to execute the request. So again, it's another convenience of the Integration Builder and its testing capabilities. In terms of response, by default, we're sending the content of the variable response, but I could instead set up an embedded template where I can write whatever I want in combination with variables. This is a test. Hello world. Smiley face. Set that up again. Start. It's probably not the best of examples because that's not fully XML, but hopefully it will give me the desired result. So here you can see that it does indeed customize the response that we are sent back. So it can be a mix of plain text, contents of integration variables, and whatever else you want. And in fact, one of the examples a bit later on will show you this. I need to press on. I'm getting a bit behind. Let's just go back to the variable. Okay. Also with a web service GET request, we can have what's called query parameters. So everything else is the same as the previous one. Again, we're printing a document, but this time we're setting the ID named data source on the document with a variable called ID. Now, where is that getting that ID variable from? Well, this is being generated by the event message that we're sending. So if we look at the event message we're sending, get query. Here we can see the URL, so nothing much different than before. But under the query, you can see that we're specifying ID and setting a value. You can make that a bit different, X, Y, Z, for example. And also there's the second named data source barcode, which we can set with a value as well. But let's do that. Let's avoid the multiple sixes. And you'll see that after the URL, it's putting the question mark, in this case, first ID equals value, ampersand, name of the variable equals, and then a value. So perhaps when you're visiting websites, you'll see these longer extended URLs where you see the question mark and then something equals something and something equals something. This is what are called parameters in a GET request. And a GET request is where everything is in the URL address. When you make such a request, these items are auto-generated as integration variables, and they can therefore be used as part of the request. So we got those there. Let's go back to my integration. And in fact, if I import updated document settings, read those in. Now we have the barcode there. So I need to replace that with ID. And I need to replace this with barcode. It's the name of the parameter as it will be set in the URL. And that will be replaced with the value that we specify in that URL address. Let's just go with the default. Okay, so let's test that. Send, and we get the response. And let's take a look at History Explorer to see what we got. Is that the right one? Ah. So XYZ, so that data was set through the URL using parameter values. Very good. So quick and easy way of setting data on the label. And in fact, what's interesting is in addition to setting named data sources, you could also set metadata items. So for example, rather than the predefined printer in the document design, or what you may select in the integration, you could say, use the content of the variable printer as being the printer that I wish to print to. So what was the one we printed? Printer A, so let's choose printer B. So if I go back, so start test. So in addition to the named data sources, we can also set the printer to which we wish to print to. So for this, I'll need to create a new parameter, which I'll call printer. And I got a barcode printer B. I'm gonna make sure that the value is correct, otherwise it's not gonna work how we expect. Send. Barcode printer B was indeed the printer we sent to. Excellent. So in this way, not only can we have dynamic data, but we can also dynamically change how the document is printed and to where the document is printed. So setting metadata items, which makes the integration you deploy that much more dynamic. Okay, let's step it up one gear further.
Ian.
Yes.
Just one thing, because I see we are trying to answer some of the questions, but there is one question regarding you are going to cover today print command script action, because that's the method we use. So don't know if you are going to discuss or just comment anything just for this person who was asking.
I did see that question.
Script.
I did see that question. I must admit, I don't have that as an example. So sorry about that. If we have time, we'll take a quick look at it.
Okay, thank you, Ian.
So we have a third web service request. And this is where we have posted data. So what is posted data? How is that different from a GET request? What is a post request? Well, a post request, if we look at the service, let's change that to, what are we going to have? Post CSV, post underscore CSV. So the main difference here is there's no, okay, you have a URL, an endpoint where the web service is. There are no parameters And the reason for this is we have payload data. In this case, it's CSV payload data. And we specify this using a header, which says that the payload is content type text, as in CSV. Is that a CSV? And we're using UTF-8 as the encoding. So a post, this is where you have payload. Typically, if you're on a website, this is where you filled in a form at your website. Maybe you're booking tickets for a flight or something, and you hit the submit button. What's happening behind the scenes is there's JavaScript that's running, which is posting all that information to the web server to record that on the web server. Posting in the aspect of BarTender is where we're posting transactional data that we're wanting to use as a data source for printing variable data labels. So here we have just simple CSV data that we're posting to our integration. In fact, let's change this to be post_CSV. So we now have the matching URL. Input data, well, this should actually be CSV data, because it's just like as if we had detected a CSV file. Essentially, at this point, it's the same as if we detected a CSV file. We have a response as before, and of course we can print the document. Importantly, though, we need to override the document database using the event data variable content. So the content from the web service request replaces the dummy data in our document design. So let's test that. And again, I cross my fingers, hoping everything works correctly. Bang. Data printed, hopefully successfully. And we can prove this if we just change some data there and hit send. Print job produced. Just refresh this, go to the top. And indeed, XXX Microtechnology is the label that printed. Now, in this case, we've had CSV data, but we could just as easily have JSON data, BarTender XML script, or regular XML of whatever schema, whichever definition of XML that you wish. And oh, there is print command script. So in this case, we have a print command script where we have the syntax of commander script, which is a legacy product, which we used for integration. So of course, this would normally be dropped as a file, but I can test in this respect as part of a web service with text-based payload. So you would have this as just text, like so. And on the integration side, well, you would have an action which would process that print command script. So it would take as an input, well, just type in event data as my input. And yeah, it processes the content of the command or script. Now, I'm aware that some customers have had some difficulties with command or script. Perhaps things were not, maybe in the past there have been a few issues reported. Maybe it's the case that some command or scripts are formatted in ways that we're not expecting and therefore it doesn't process correctly. For that, we'll have to come back to you. I can't get bogged down into that in the presentation today. But generally speaking, for processing these legacy command or scripts, you would have an action that does that instead of this predefined print document action. Database integrations. I have two different database integrations there because I'm detecting an insertion of a database record and the updating of a database record. If we look at the first one, essentially what we're doing is we establish a connection to a database. In this case, it's an Access database. And I choose, well, I have two options. I have an option to specify a field that is an incrementing field that is unique. So typically you'd have some sort of ID that auto increments, that auto populates. And essentially, as part of the design, we see what the last value is. And every, in this case, 3 seconds, we're looking to see if there is a new record with a value that's higher than this. And if there is, we take that record as a data source so that when we're printing, we have these two actions here. First, we take that record as event data. And then for our print document action, we have our document and we override the database with the current record. So our document design is again connecting to a standard CSV file, but of the same structure as the database. So the document design is actually taking a data file. It's not connecting to the database directly. It's taking a data file of the same field structure because we're going to override that dummy data with the variable data of the current record that we just detected through an inserted record in the database. I hope that makes sense. Let's see it in action, shall we? So hit test, start it up. And this is where I need to open up my Access database. It's not the easiest of things to demonstrate, so please bear with me. So here we have my Access database. There's 100 odd records of data. Let's use my name, shall we? Seagull Sigh, some road in Madrid. This is not a real address, of course, by the way. Some fake telephone number. Scroll across. You notice the customer number there. That's the unique field. So 151. Let's just put a number then in those. It can be unique. What day is it today? Uh, 2021. Okay, enter. We switch over to yes. After a second or two, it detects that record, uses that record as a data source, essentially providing it to the document as in the same way as a data file, and it is then printed. So let's take a look at the History Explorer, see if it printed the correct data. Yes, it did. I love it. Excellent. I do like it when things work. So stop that. And back to the Create menu. And let's take a look at how update is different. And how update is different, everything else is the same, except we're looking at a different field, in this case, the record date, and we're looking to see if there is a newer date in the date field for the record date, thus indicating that a record has been changed or updated recently. So let's test that. Start. It may well detect that one I just inserted or not. Okay, let's go to one of these other records. So I want to update this one. Should be the case that we detect that. Okay, so yeah, it's just the last recorded date was messed up. So now it's now detected those updated records. And of course, we can then view those. And we can see that those records that we updated have now been printed. What's nice about the database integration is that we're not being pushed a message from the business system. Instead, we are detecting by way of looking at the business system perform its own internal tasks. So we're viewing what's going on, and when we see that our record is being updated in the database tables of that system, we can then extract that data and make use of it for our own printing requirements. It's more of a hands-off type integration, if that makes sense. Particularly useful for those customers who say, I don't care what you do, but I don't want you to change or touch my existing business system. Email integrations, and I have to push on quickly with some of these because we're running out of time. With an email integration, of course, I specify my mailbox properties and then define what particular email message we're looking for. So I can check every X number of seconds or minutes, go by a subject line, so anything test underscore content underscore something. And when I detect that email, I can then delete that email because, of course, whether it's the content of the email or the attachment of the email, we're using that as the record-based data source. So we can use both. We can use either the content or an attachment. So indeed, if we go and come to the input data settings, for the content, I'm using the email body content as input data. So typically the email would want to be in plain text, so not a fancy HTML. Let's close that. Not a fancy HTML email, but a plain text email containing CSV, JSON, or XML data. Or as we have with this one, we can make use of the email attachment. So you could attach a CSV file to your email, or a JSON file to your email, or an XML file to your email. And we'll use that, setting it to the event data variable as our record-based data source for our actions that we then execute. Okay, so what I'll do first is I need to send these emails. So here we have an email here. So I'm sending it to myself, and here's the CSV data. Let's just change this, Seagull, and I'll hit send. The reason I'm sending it now is because I have a 1 minute delay on all emails that I send, just in case I make a mistake. And also the one in attachment, this one here. So I have an email here. It doesn't matter about the body because it's the attachment that's of relevance. So I'll send that as well. Okay, so go to test and start. The problem with email is I've got a delay on the email I'm sending, which is just an Outlook thing that I've set up. But also I'm only scanning once every 30 seconds, so there may be a bit of a delay there. Someone's got a question. What would be a good question to answer at this point? What mail servers are supported? POP, IMAP, off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I would need to look. We have to get back to you on that one. Can you process an email with more Excel files than one? Ooh, I would need to stop detection and have a look and tell you. Can one import integration setup from version 10? So integrations in version 10 is making use of Commander. And yes, you can import a Commander task list as an integration file in the integration builder. I'll show you that a bit later. But yes, you would import the task list from Commander, but then I would recommend you making use of the testing sandbox of the integration builder to make sure everything is working as you expect it to. It should be noted that because of the limitations with Commander, there were many features and functions that Commander simply did not have. People would work around those limitations by perhaps creating many Commander tasks. And with the integration platform, because of the dynamic nature, making use of integration variables, it's quite often the case that you don't need as many tasks. You can have perhaps just a handful of tasks. So you're building an integration in a more intelligent fashion, making use of the features of the integration platform. So although you can import, sometimes it may make sense to just start again from scratch and to build your integrations in a much more dynamic and powerful way. Now it's working. Okay. So it's taken the content of that. Stop that and let's see History Explorer. Yes, Seagull. Haha, it worked. Right. So let's go with the attachment one. And one of the questions there was, oops, wrong one. One of the questions was, can we spin through multiple attachments? run actions for each email attachment and use attachment's content as input data. So yes is the answer. We'll produce a print job for each attachment. So that's another one ticked for the Q&A department. So let's enable this one, and the email should be already there. So hopefully it picks that up pretty quickly. David, while it's waiting for the 30 seconds, is there a question I could answer now, perhaps?
Let me take a look. I think we are covering most of the questions so far. But now is a perfect time for me to remind you that in 20 minutes or so, we should finish, and in order to allow another 15 minutes for Q&A. So just a reminder about the timing that is left.
You're a hard taskmaster, David.
You asked me to do it. You asked me, David, please let me know if I'm taking so much time talking about different integration. So
yeah, but I didn't mean it. Come on. So there we detected the file with the attachment. I'll be very brief then. We also have network socket, serial port, and message queue. And these two, serial port and network socket, are much alike. Let's take a look at these first. Typically with network socket and serial port, this is where we're communicating with a device. It may not always be the case, but it could be a PLC or a weigh scale on the production line that's connected with a network cable or a serial port cable. And each of these, we're listening for a stream of data. So rather than a discrete set of data, we're listening for a stream of data. So with a network socket, well, we can choose our protocol, TCP or UDP, which is a network protocol. The port number, it's 1024 by default, but you can change that to whatever network port number you want. And you can specify which devices you're listening on, either all your network cards or a specific one. In terms of the input data, you're choosing our encoding type, and we're choosing what constitutes the end of the stream. So we're listening, we're taking in a stream of data, but then when's the chop? When's the cutoff point? So it can be a sequence of characters received after a specified number of characters, when the port becomes idle or is disconnected. And depending on the nature of the data being sent to you, you'll choose one of those options, and of course, select your appropriate data format. It's a similar case for a serial port. You'll choose your port, your communication settings, and also how you're picking up that input data in terms of the cutoff, because it's a stream of data rather than a discrete package of data, so to speak. One thing with serial port is, without an external device or an external computer, it's a bit tricky for me to demonstrate that, because with a network socket, I can send a network message from my computer to myself. But with serial port, if you're sending, you're in fact locking that serial port, so you can't also receive it at the same time, which makes it a real pain to demonstrate. But I can demonstrate the network socket one. And what I'll do for this is handy for you partners out there, is what I've done is I built a document with a data entry form. And the purpose of this document is to send messages. So it doesn't matter if I preview or print, but basically when I click on one of these buttons, it will send a message to in this case, the network port with some CSV data. I had a little form action to show a message saying that I sent that. And indeed, if we look, yes, we received some CSV data and we produced a print job. Wonderful. If I look at my document here, I just close that and inspect the properties of the button I created here. We can see on the control clicked event, we're sending a network message with message data variable being used, and we're sending it to myself on that port as mentioned earlier. And then I have a show message action that confirms to the user that the message was sent. So where is that message data coming from? Well, it's a named data source. So in a data entry form, if you have a named data source, these named data sources also act as a variable. So if I open the properties of that, I can see the content of that named data source is our familiar CSV data. So it's a nice little demo trick you can use when presenting to your customers if you don't have some sort of application for sending network socket messages. There's a similar thing for Microsoft Message Queue. So the actions here, I'm sending a message to this queue here. It's on my computer. It's to a private queue called Siegel webinar event. So this is a message queue that I created. I'm guessing we're running a bit out of time to go into that in too much detail. But message queue is, let's just start this up again. A message queue is very similar to a print job queue in that it's unlike a web service where when you're sending the web service, in order for the web service to be successful, the receiver has to be up and running and ready to receive. With message queue, a message can be sent to the queue, but if the and it stays there until the receiver comes to look and get it. So it's very similar to a print job queue. So if the printer is offline, you produce a print job, the print job is in the queue, and the printer, if it's offline or it's not powered up, that print job will remain in the queue until the printer comes online. When the printer comes online, it sees that the print job is in the queue and the message is then sent. It's a very similar concept for Microsoft Message Queue in that we're putting messages to the queue, and when the receiver is ready to come get it, it will go and get it and the message will be sent. So it's more useful for those customers who need to ensure that the message, it looks like I already had a couple of messages already in the queue. I'll just stop it and start it again. So it's a good option to choose if the customer wants to ensure that the request is processed rather than the importance of it being processed in a timely manner, or whether it's a success or failure, and that being transmitted back to the origin. What's important is that the actual request is processed eventually. So we're waiting for a response. Let's send the request. And we see, because the integration is running, it performs and processes it straight away. You'll notice though that I probably hit send on this a couple of times last night. So that request remained in the queue. So when I first started it up, it did actually process those print requests which were made from last night. So that kind of underlines the fact that that request will stay there until the receiver is ready to receive and process them. I do hope that made sense. And lastly, time schedule. This is a very different integration in that we're not actually listening for a message. We're waiting for a particular date and time to occur. So we can run actions on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. So scheduled on a schedule, did I say? You can run it immediately. And of course, you can have a recurrence. So here I'm wishing to run actions which will occur every 10 seconds and to do so indefinitely. And what I'm doing as an action is I'm writing some data out to the message log of BarTender. So another 10 seconds has elapsed and using a variable current time. So let's test that out. So we have our initial item there. Again, if I switch to History Explorer, and instead of print jobs, I'll go to messages. Another 10 seconds has elapsed. Another 10 seconds has elapsed. At least I hope it's 10 seconds. So you can see that on a continual basis, we're performing actions. In this case, I'm just writing an output to a log, but I could be doing something else instead, such as checking the status on a web service or whatever it is that a customer needs to do. A common one is with the file integration. So where am I? So if I stop this, so I don't fill up my message log. With a file integration, we're of course scanning for files. And when we detect the file, we can move it to an archive folder. Now, perhaps over the course of many months, that archive folder gets to be pretty full. What we can do with a time schedule is if I add another action, I can make use of a file action to delete files. So what I'm wanting to do is delete files that are older than a certain age. So I'll browse to that particular folder, to that completed folder. Where is it? So webinar, scan folder completed. Okay. Any file I don't care. Include files older than, let's say, 180 days. So if you don't want a folder filling up with millions of files, you can say, well, after X number of days, we'll use this scheduled integration to just delete those files. With this sort of action, you perhaps would want to change the schedule to be running daily, just the once, for example. So that acts as a good housekeeping integration or housekeeping action. Okay, so those are the various integration types. what I want to do now, so long as we don't run out of time, is to look at some interesting integration actions, some interesting use cases. And for this, I'll be making use of web services all the way because it's just quicker and easier to demonstrate. So I have a few different integrations here that illustrate a few different ways of doing some things. So first off, the medical product integration to print a medical product label. So it's a web service. Here's the name of the service. The input data is XML. And the response, well, I've customized the response. So I'm using an embedded template where I'm writing out some XML in a manual fashion, matching the XML schema of the business system, for example, what that business system expecting to get back. And you'll notice that I'm using integration variables here to insert some variable data items, such as the date and time, the ID of the initial request, the print job status, which is success or failure, the messages of the human readable message, and also in this case, because it's a medical device and it's got a unique serial number on, I'm wanting to return the unique serial number value that was printed on the label. So I can do that in the response there as well, which confirms the serial number that was printed. So let's test this. Start it up. And come to my medical device. So here's what I'm requesting. I'm using XML. You'll notice in some of these attributes, I got those metadata items, such as the ID of the request, the name of the document, the name of the printer I'm wanting to print to, and also we have the variable data, which can include picture data. So here we have base64 encoded picture data. So let's quickly send that. And something went wrong. It didn't pick up the print job status. Okay. The name of the document does not exist. UID label. I know. I keep getting mixed up with UID and UDI. Let's try that again. Did I stop detection? Okay. So here we can see, okay, in my document design, a couple of the text objects were clipped. So I need to look at my document design and fix those. But the label's still printed. It's just perhaps some of the text was clipped based on my document design. Now, I've just realized one thing I've not shown you. So I've been showing you these different integrations and how they work, but I haven't yet shown you how to deploy. So perhaps rather than running each of these in the test environment, I will show you in the integration builder that I will actually deploy this particular integration to the server. So for this, I'll switch over to the administration console, go to the integration section, click on Add, browse to my integration file, so desktop, webinar folder, example 2, open that up, choose my particular configuration profile. So test, production, or I can set up a custom profile. For this example, I'll just use the test one, as this defines my computer as being the production server onto which I wish to deploy. The integration doesn't already exist, so it doesn't matter if I try to cancel it, if it does. So next, and I can schedule when I wish to deploy. Yeah, deploying now, obviously, as we're doing a live demo, that's what I want to do. But I can deploy in a production maintenance window or on a specified date or time. Finish. So think about that for a couple of seconds and deploys. And you'll notice when it's deployed, each of these are started automatically, so they're actively listening for events. And the name of the integration are all self-explanatory. So if I called each of these web service 1, 2, and 3, I wouldn't have a clue which one's which. Because they have a functional name, it's easy to understand which is the one I want to examine. So from here, I suppose I'll trigger an event first to see what it does, what it looks like. So trigger an event, event occurrence 1. Let's take a look at it. So we can see the various messages that were generated. We can examine some of that. So if we want to see the values of particular items as they were at the time of print, we can drill down into these by clicking on these icons to see what the value of things were as it was processing the job. So it allows you to monitor and manage those integrations as they're running. Okay, let's look at the next one, the packing label one. Now this is an interesting one. With the packing label one, what we're doing here is we're printing a document, and this particular document is a little different from most in that it's connecting to JSON data, and part of the document is, come on, hurry up and preview. Part of the document is using a document level set of data, but we also have a table here with multiple records of data presented in the table. Probably easier to show you this in the document itself. So let's do that. Packing label, open that up. Okay, so we have two data connections, the database for the document, database connection for the document, and the data connection for the table. Now, in actual fact, they're both connecting to the same JSON data. So when we get the event data from, in this case, a web service call, we're sending just one set of JSON data. But you'll notice because this is hierarchical data, you have this top level information, like the company name and address and stuff. And then you have a packing list of repeatable items. So in this case, we have 3 records of packing list items, but you could have more, of course, depending on how much space you have on the label design. So this is the document level setup, and this is connecting to, and I've named this connection document data. Likewise, if I come into the table, it has its own data connection. Again, connecting to the same JSON data, except this time, if I just run through the wizard, So here's the data, except this time I'm only interested in the packing list information. So I'm not taking this top level information, I'm only taking the data for the packing list because that's all the data I want represented in the table. Whereas in the document level connection, I've got all of these top level items selected, but none of the packing list items, if that makes sense. So two separate connections connecting to the same data. And at the integration level, oh, wrong integration file. At the integration level, database overrides, I'm overriding two data connections and I specify them by name. Document data with variable event data and table data using that same data source. So when I come to this one, when I come to make the print request, I've got one set of JSON data. I hit send. Remember, I've deployed the integration, so I don't have to run it in the test environment. I can see that I had a second occurrence, and indeed, I can see that I had a print job, and the print job was sent to printer B. I could change that to be printer A, and it will send that to printer A instead, like so. And you may be asking, how was I able to extract that data? Well, I did that using this action here, which is to set a variable, which I gave the name of printer, and I'm using a integration variable expression. So with integration variable expression, I can use a JSON, I can use a JavaScript function on my event data, where I'm passing the JSON data, so I'm taking bits out of the JSON data, and I'm specifying that it's the printer field value in particular that I'm interested in. And if I look at the JSON itself, I have this value here called printer. It's that what I want to extract out to the printer variable, which is what I then use in my print document action, where I use printer. We have requests for printing to PDF. We don't support that directly as a feature, as an action to print a PDF that's already created, but we can implement it. So we're detecting a file being dropped as a PDF, and we don't want to read the contents of the PDF. We just want to be able to print that PDF. So make sure you deselect the read event contents because it's not a data file. But in terms of actions, this is where support for the PowerShell command comes in, because PowerShell is very, dare I say, powerful scripting language that allows us to make a much more fuller usage of Windows .NET framework. So for here, we're making use of a PDF to printer application tool, which is, I think it's a public domain application. If you search it on the internet, you'll find it, and you can make use of it. So we're running this exe, specifying some command lines to set the name of the document, the name of the PDF that we want to print. So here I'm using a predefined variable detected file path, and I can set the name of the printer that I wish to print. So send it to print barcode printer B, and that will take the PDF that we detected as a trigger and print it to that printer. So we're not using BarTender in any respect to produce that PDF print job. We're just taking an already generated PDF and using this third-party tool to print it using a command line. So this is what PowerShell enables. It enables us to do bespoke things that we don't currently have native support for in BarTender or the integration platform. The second integration in particular I wanted to show was print preview. This is another feature as an action we don't directly support, but it can again be implemented. And the way we implement it is through the use of BTXML script. Because BTXML script, BarTender's XML script, does indeed support print preview. So I use an embedded script where I can specify that I want to return the images in the response, that this is the name of our document, and I can insert some variable data items like so. For example, the ID and the barcode, and the format of the images like PNG, color depth, the DPI of the print job, etc. As an option, I can choose to transform the outputted BTXML response so that I'm just grabbing the image data. So if I test this, preview, where is it? So if I test this, I'm using just a GET request asking for a print preview, and I'm setting those two query parameter values. Let's change this to XYZ, for example. Hit send. Here we see the base64 encoded response. I just select all and copy that. And because BarTender documents can actually display a base64 encoded image, I'll just use that feature, so an encoded picture, like so, to show you that the result was as expected. Yes. And there we can see printed label XYZ for the ID. Okay, David, hit me with some questions.
Great. Okay, Ian. Yes, well, it was during your presentation, Ian. Someone asked, do the deleted files go into the recycle bin, or are they gone? So I think it was at one moment you were doing the demo. I'm not sure if you remember this.
Looks like it's a permanent delete, so it's not in the recycle bin.
Okay. Another one is, after deployment, is the link with the integration file maintained, or can you delete the integration?
So if I move this on screen, there's a hidden folder in Windows called Program Data. So under C, Program Data. So this is a hidden folder of Windows, which Windows uses for applications to store their program-specific data. And that, of course, includes us here at Siegel Scientific. So if I open up that, you can see there's different aspects of the Siegel Scientific software which we're using to store program data. It's like configuration data, logs, various admin type, diagnostic type information, and configurations. For a deployed integration, if we dive into the services, I think it's this one, the services folder, and then integrations, and then service, I think it is. Yes. What you'll see here is when you're deploying, we're actually making a copy of BarTender integration file and storing it in the program data. So your working file, the one that was in my webinar folder, is just that. It's a working file. It's used by the designer, the person who's building and configuring it, and they can store that wherever they wish, because of course when you deploy, we're actually deploying that file to this service folder, which is a hidden folder under program data. And you'll notice that it's appended this globally unique identifier, GUID, to the end. Where is that coming from? Well, if I were to open that integration file in a text editor, and let's just move this text editor on screen, you'll see an integration file is actually an XML file. So all the configuration of it is in this XML. But we have this, oops, don't do that. But we have this at the top, this ID, which is also used as a check, not a check digit, a hash of the file to confirm its integrity. So it's a unique value which identifies the file, but also ensures that it hasn't been modified outside of the integration builder. So it prevents some bad actor going to that program data file and modifying it in a text editor, because of course the ID would not match. So this one ends C8EOCE. And if we look at the name of the file in the service, indeed it's the same. Well, as you can see, there is much else besides in the integration. Any of you guys need more in-depth or more targeted information, then certainly get in touch with us and we can see if we can go through that with you directly. I'd also like to bring your attention to our website, of course, particularly the support portal, because here we have many articles and videos on different aspects of the software, of course, including integration. So we have various articles on integration builder, how to use it, how to set it up. Also, if you keep scrolling, there's webinars, and we have integration specific webinars. And someone was asking about print command script. In fact, we do actually have a webinar that covers that exact topic. It's a few years old now, but it should still be relevant. And yes, with that, thank you very much for your time, guys. Hope that was of use to you, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time for the programmatic integration of BarTender, which
thank you, Ian. Thank you,
we're all looking
everybody.
forward to.
And we are finishing the webinar for today. You all will receive the recording and all the material that Ian has been using today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.